I'm going to begin, as many of my talks do, with a sailor named Edward Barlow, who is very interesting for a number of reasons. I'm sure he's familiar to those of you who know about the history of the 17th century. He spent most of his adult life as a sailor. He spent almost 5 decades working as a sailor. He traveled to the Mediterranean, to India and China, to the Caribbean, really very widely. He worked on naval ships, he worked on merchant ships, and he's particularly interesting because he wrote a journal of all of these voyages, which survives today in the collections of the National Maritime Museum. So you can see a few pages on display in the Tudor and Stuart Seafarers Gallery, and you can find some illustrations from the journal on the museum website as well, if you go and look at their collections. And this is an illustration you can see on the screen here. So this journal sheds a wonderful light on life at sea during the 17th century and really gives us a great starting point for thinking about Christmas at sea. And Barlow doesn't really have a lot of good things to say about his experiences of Christmas at sea. So one of his early voyages in 1661, he writes about spending his first Christmas that ever I was out of England, but not the last by a great many. We had but small Christmas cheer, not having Christmas pie or roast beef or plum pottage or such like. I remembering that the poorest people in all England would have a bit of something that was good on such a day, and that many beggars would fare better than we did, for we had nothing but a little bit of Irish beef to 4 men, which had lain in pickle 2 or 3 years and was as rusty as the devil, with a little stinking oil or butter, which was all colours of the rainbow. So he paints a really quite grim picture of old and disgusting food, and nothing like the kind of quality of food that people would be expecting on Christmas. And he makes similar comments on other occasions throughout his journal, and perhaps his worst Christmas at sea was actually in 1672, when he was a prisoner in Batavia, in what is now Jakarta, when he'd been captured by the Dutch East India Company. And there he says, instead of good pies and roast meat, we were content with a little boiled rice and a piece of stinking beef, which they gave us 3 days in the week, and a quart of stinking water to drink. So again, he's really focusing on the poor quality of the provisions that he was receiving while a prisoner. Ironically, only a few hundred miles south of Jakarta is an island that a couple of decades before Barlow's experiences there was named Christmas Island, when an East India Company ship sailed past it on Christmas Day. So he may have been thinking of that association when he bemoaned his lack of Christmas cheer as a prisoner in Batavia. It's also significant to think about this time of him as a prisoner, because that's when he started writing this journal. He had a lot of time on his hands, and he wrote that he started writing his recollections of his time at sea as a prisoner over several months, and then he continued writing them afterwards for the rest of his career. So that probably tells us something about his frame of mind in which he was writing about these experiences, and may explain some of the negativity that we see in his depiction of Christmas at this time. So what I'd like to talk about, though, is the way that even his negative comments show how important Christmas was to him, and even in its absence. And I'd like to reflect on that a little bit through this talk. So to give a bit of context about Christmas, one thing we get from Barlow's complaints is what he was expecting would be going on during Christmas ashore. And to go to Erin's comment about whether Christmas ashore, Christmas at sea was better, Christmas ashore was definitely better in Barlow's opinion. There wouldn't have been necessarily advent calendars. There would have been, or chocolates arriving in November. There would have been a lot of fasting leading up to Christmas. But then the 12 days of Christmas, from Christmas Day to Epiphany on the 6th of January, would have been a sort of continuous party. That's certainly the way commentators depict it at the time, and really beginning on Christmas Eve. Presents would have been exchanged on New Year's Day. You can see in the title of one of the ballads that I have on this screen that the Milkmaid's New Year's gift. So New Year's Day was the day for presents. But across the 25th of December to the 6th of January, there would have been continuous entertainment, feasting, drinking, indulging, and a lot of time spent in church as well, at special sermons, festivals, carol singing. The other ballad here is a series of carols printed on a ballad sheet, the first of which is God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, which you may be familiar with, although I don't know if it was sung to the same tune at that time. But so many of the things that Barlow complains about not having were really essential to the experience of Christmas. So roast beef, brave plum porridge, these are mentioned in the Merry Boys of Christmas. Plum porridge, or plum pottage, incidentally, was another beef-based dish, but with dried fruit or prunes, and it was a broth that was boiled down in many ways, kind of maybe as a forerunner of Christmas pudding, because it was very, very thick. And similarly, mince pies, which again would have had mince or mutton, so a meat dish, but with spiced fruits and dried fruits in them as well. So this sort of sweet and savory was really characteristic of Christmas. Geese were also a very common dish, and turkey had started to appear, being brought by ships such as Barlow's from the Americas. It was nowhere near as definitive as it is now, but turkeys were definitely an option for Christmas dinner at this time. Entertainment would have included wassailing, going drinking with your friends, starting from Christmas Eve onwards. Mummers' plays, which were a very common form of local and almost amateur drama at this time, which often had a sort of religious moral hidden within a lot of comedy and humor. Caroling, as I've mentioned, other kinds of singing, playing games, cards, dancing. You can see some of these depicted here on the ballads. And we have a picture of life ashore from another person associated with the Navy. This is Samuel Peeps, who was a naval administrator and wrote a diary covering the period of the 1660s. And so in 1660, he wrote about getting his house ready against tomorrow being Christmas Day. Whether that meant hanging decorations or just finishing off some building work is not entirely clear, but he was clearly building up to Christmas. And then on Christmas Day itself, he and his wife went to church and heard a sermon, and then they went and had a good dinner with his brother with a good shoulder of mutton and chicken, and then they went to another sermon, during which I have to admit Peeps fell asleep, which may be the equivalent of sort of after dinner television on Christmas Day nowadays. But they spent much of that time going to church services and also visiting friends and neighbors, going for dinner. Peeps does record doing some business for the Navy, but also playing his lute, spending time reading. On New Year's morning, as well as exchanging presents, they had oysters, neat's tongue, anchovies, wines of all sorts, and North Down ale, and they were very, very merry, as Peeps writes, and many of the other Christmases in his diary are very similar. Now, Christmas was also traditionally a time of charity. This is part of the sort of religious dimension of this festival, when wealthier householders would have opened their houses to their poorer neighbors and provided them with food and drink. But there is some discussion through the 17th century about the decline of this practice. There's a pamphlet in the 1630s called The Complaint of Christmas, which contrasts a stingy lord of the manor, who had once been famous for hospitality, refusing to give out any food or drink. And then much more positive is the plain countryman who has a very cheerful house and all his friends round and providing them with good cheer. So there's a sort of early forerunner of Dickens with Cratchit and Scrooge appearing perhaps in that pamphlet. But we also see some court records around the Christmas time, and historians like Mark Elwood have worked on this, showing thefts by those who cannot afford their own festive feast and showing people driven to desperate measures. And we see a rise in inequality and in poverty in society across this period, which is actually also linked to the economic developments around shipping, in which Barlow himself is involved. So Barlow's claim that beggars had it better than sailors is probably a bit much. I mean, at least the sailors did indeed have some food to eat on Christmas Day. But there's another angle here that I think is really interesting to think about, coming back to Barlow and his experiences of life, both ashore and at sea. Pepys's diary entries that I read to you and the Merry Boys of Christmas, this ballad, are both from 1660. And that's a very important year in the history of England and of Christmas. So it's the year that the Stuart monarchy is restored. And actually, Barlow travels on the ship that brings Charles II back to England, which is what's being displayed here. So it's when Christmas itself is also restored with the monarchy, because Christmas had been restricted under the period of the civil wars and Cromwell's rule. Now, it's often said that Cromwell himself banned Christmas, and this is not entirely true. He himself didn't bring in these laws, but Parliament during the period of the civil wars and into the Republican reign in the 1650s had indeed imposed laws that restricted the celebration of Christmas. They weren't banning Christmas itself, but they were opposed to frivolous celebrations. They wanted much more solemnity. They wanted spiritual contemplation and fasting. So they were trying to restrict parties and celebrations in favor of spending time in quiet and sober reflection. And they also brought in laws to make sure that shops would stay open on Christmas Day, to try and treat it like any other day. And they brought in fines to prevent people from celebrating Christmas. Now, these laws were sometimes met with riots, and there was a great degree of varying compliance because Parliament's control over the country across this period was never really complete. In fact, in 1656, some MPs complained that they had been kept awake by parties very near their Christmas lodgings, Christmas parties in Westminster, shocking behavior. But what also produced a response to this attempt to ban Christmas or restrict Christmas was a series of satirical pamphlets published through the 1650s defending Christmas. And you can see an image from one of those pamphlets on the slide here. And what I think is really interesting about these pamphlets is that they seem to be the first time that the figure of Father Christmas appears regularly in print. So the personification of Christmas had been happening for a long time, for centuries, but that phrase Father Christmas and that association of a sort of elderly and generous figure seems to have come about in this political situation, in these pamphlets that are trying to defend the spirit of Christmas and defend celebrations of Christmas as generous and as religious in the sense of charity and helping neighbours and neighbourliness and so on. And so ironically, Parliament's efforts to ban Christmas actually gave it one of its most enduring characters even today, although the Father Christmas of these pamphlets is not really the same as Santa Claus, and there's a sort of longer development that we see in subsequent centuries. So as I said, Barlow was involved in the restoration. He was on the ship that brought Charles II back to England. And he was also only a few years old when Christmas was officially banned, and he was 18 at the age of the restoration. So these could be very formative years experiencing these restrictions on Christmas for him. But it is worth noting that his grumbles about Christmas being spent at sea are perhaps a little exaggerated, because we do have some evidence that Christmas was being celebrated at sea. And even if it wasn't the same as the celebrations I've been discussing happening ashore, then there were some efforts to mark this occasion. So we do know that religious services happened on ships. Francis Drake's voyages, for example, about 100 years earlier, had sermons and church services. So it's very likely that some ships would have had a religious service for Christmas Day. Ships also seem to have attempted to find an island or some location where they could have refreshing. This is again something that Francis Drake did for his 6 sailors one Christmas Day in the Caribbean. We know that Thomas James, who led an expedition to try and find the Northwest Passage, spent the winter in Hudson Bay in the early 17th century. And he says that he kept Christmas Day holy, which we solemnized in the joyfulest manner we could. So presumably, again, a spiritual and also a social occasion. He said they had good cheer. How many of his men who were at that time dying of frostbite really enjoyed these occasions is a moot point, but it seems like at least they were making an effort. And similarly, William Dampier, who was a privateer and a contemporary of Barlow's, who traveled through the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, during one of his own voyages, came off the coast of Mexico, said that they were desirous to have a Christmas dinner. So they sent out some canoes and caught 3 great Jewfish, or Atlantic Goliath grouper, as we might call them now, which feasted us all. And then they went and caught some more on Boxing Day. So it wasn't exactly the same as the kind of food and drink and services and celebrations they would have had ashore, but they were at least trying to have a good dinner and some sort of celebration, and perhaps even some sort of solemnity as well. Now, Barlow himself probably did celebrate Christmas at sea in a slightly better manner than he depicted in those instances that I referred to earlier. He writes when he's drawing his ships that he always chose to draw his ships in the manner of them being decorated on important holidays. Now, he doesn't say this was something that happened at Christmas, but that was obviously an important holiday. So it's possible that, as you can see here, on Christmas Day or other important festivities, the ships would have put out all their flags and all their great decorations as a way of marking the occasion. And he also says that he kept Christmas on some occasions. He doesn't really elaborate on what that means, but presumably it was some sort of ritual and festivity as well. Often when he's in port, so in places like in Lisbon, in Hull, where he remembers getting fresh beef, which is really good food, in Surat in India, in Marseille, where he says they walked abroad to take our recreation and see about the town. He also mentioned the very good wine at Marseille on that occasion. So even sometimes when he was distant from his family, distant from his home in England, there were still hints that Christmas was being celebrated in a slightly better way than the more negative comments in his journal suggest. And it's also worth adding that he spent a lot of winters ashore, particularly later in his career when he had a wife and a family of his own, when he was a ship captain for the East India, or a ship master or ship's mate for the East India Company. He would come back from long voyages and spend 6 months ashore, often over the winter. So he must have had some Christmases ashore. And I strongly suspect that there were Christmas celebrations in the Barlow household at that time, much in the vein of Peeps or others that I've been talking about here. So I do wonder, just to finish off with a thought, I do wonder if Barlow's experience as a child when Christmas was officially under restrictions, and then in his early time at sea when he was more likely to be away, when he was more likely to be experiencing these difficult situations that he refers to, really meant that those festivities came to have an extra special meaning for him throughout the course of his life. And I think that after our own experiences over the last few years, that's something that we can all really sympathize with. And that's the point I'd like to finish on. So thank you very much. Merry Christmas, everyone. And I'm looking forward to the next few speakers.